The old men who ruled the world always built their power in iron. Erik Lehnsherr had learned that before he learned to read. He had felt it in the gates of Auschwitz, in the railway spikes that held together the infrastructure of genocide, in the rifles and the wire in the boots of men who believed that cruelty, if organized well enough, became civilization. Iron was the material of domination. Every empire that had ever ground human bones into the earth had done it with iron. So when the anomaly deposited him above a continent he did not recognize, when he steadied himself in the air 300 feet above a gray northern sea and cast his senses outward, tasting the magnetic signatures of this new world, what he felt did not surprise him. Iron everywhere. Crude, unrefined, but vast. Swords and chains and cage bars and manacles. Armies moving across frozen plains, their weapons singing a dull Ferris hymn. A great city on a bay, dense with the metal of 10,000 soldiers. And at the center of that city, in a castle of gray stone, something that made him go very still in the cold air. A throne. He could feel its shape before he saw it. Swords, hundreds of them, welded and twisted into a seat of power. The blades of defeated enemies, he would later learn. A chair designed to be uncomfortable, to remind whoever sat in it that power was not ease, that ruling was suffering. Magneto almost laughed. Instead, he descended. He came down outside the city walls at dusk, walking through the gates of King's Landing, like a man who had never learned what it meant to ask permission. The guards saw his bearing and his strange clothes and reached for their weapons. He looked at them with the patient contempt of a man who had faced down nuclear warheads, and the swords trembled in their scabbards, and the guards stepped aside. The city stank. That was his first impression, a medieval sprawl of filth and desperation and rot. The poor packed into warrens beneath the shadows of the wealthy. He had seen this before too, not in the specifics but in the architecture of it. The way power arranged the powerless, the geography of who was allowed to live where, the casual brutality of a system so old no one thought to question it. He found a tavern. He sat. He listened. It didn't take long to understand the situation. The great king was dead. Had been dead for some time, apparently. His son, a monster by all accounts, also dead. The current king, a child. The queen mother clinging to power with the particular desperation of someone who knows the floor is falling. The family that had held the throne for generations. The Lannisters, he gathered, the ones with the gold, fracturing from within. And somewhere beyond the northern wall, something ancient was moving. He ordered wine he didn't drink and listened to the city talk about itself. By midnight, he understood the essential truth of Westeros. This was a continent that had been doing the same thing for 10,000 years. The houses rose and fell, the names changed, the faces changed, but the machinery was identical. The powerful consumed the weak and called it tradition. The throne, that obscene iron throne, sat at the center of it all, and men killed each other for the privilege of sitting on its blades. He thought about Charles. Charles would tell him to engage carefully, to observe, to find the peaceful path. Charles wasn't here. He made his first move quietly, which was not what anyone who knew his reputation would have expected. He sent a message to Cersei Lannister, not through a raven, through a knight, a man he'd stopped in an alley who'd been in the process of robbing a young girl of her week's earnings. Magneto had lifted the man 6 feet off the ground by the iron buckles of his armor and delivered his message with the economy of someone who did not repeat himself. Tell the queen there is a man in the city who wishes to discuss the nature of power. He will come to her, or she will find she has fewer nights than she remembers. Cersei received him in a private audience, because Cersei Lannister had survived this long by knowing which threats to take seriously. She was exactly what he'd expected, brilliant, cornered, and dangerous in the specific way that people become dangerous when they have everything to lose. She sat in a chair that was not the Iron Throne. No one sat on the Iron Throne without claiming it, and she was not ready to make that claim openly. And she looked at him with green eyes that were busy calculating. "You're not from any of the 7 kingdoms," she said. "No? Where then?" "Far away, a world your masters have not mapped." She didn't believe him, but she filed it away. "What do you want?" It was the right question. He respected her for asking it immediately without preamble. "I want to understand this game you're all playing," he said. And then I want to change the rules." He did not destroy the Iron Throne that first night, though he could have. He went to the throne room alone, an hour before dawn, when the castle was quiet. He stood before it in the darkness, this massive, ugly thing, a monument to the idea that history was made by the victorious, that the weapons of the defeated existed only to glorify those who had defeated them. He reached out with his power and felt every sword that composed it, felt their individual histories, the metal's memory, if he was being poetic about it, and sometimes he was. Hundreds of blades, generations of war made into furniture. He could reduce it to a sphere of scrap in under a second. He didn't, not yet. Because Magneto had learned, through painful decades of being right about everything and still losing, that destroying a symbol before people were ready to let go of it only made the symbol more powerful. You didn't tear down the throne. You made the throne irrelevant. You made people look at it and see not power but the shape of their own captivity. He left it standing. For now. The political education came quickly after that. He was, whatever his faults, an exceptionally fast learner. The Tyrells controlled the food. The Lannisters controlled the gold, or had before the mines ran dry, a fact Cersei had disclosed to him with the careful casualness of someone testing whether he already knew. The Martells nursed a grudge that had been aging for decades. In the north, a dead family's name was apparently enough to inspire loyalty even without living heirs. The Stark name lingered like a bruise over the whole northern half of the continent, and across the sea, dragons. That gave him pause. He had encountered a great many things in his life. Mutants who could reshape matter, men in iron suits, gods with hammers, but dragons were new. He filed them under significant variables and kept listening. What he kept returning to, in his analysis, was the small folk. Nobody was thinking about the small folk. Every player in this game, Cersei, the Tyrells, the various claimants to the throne, treated the common people of Westeros as a resource to be taxed, conscripted, or ignored. The peasants who starved when armies burned their crops. The craftsmen who watched their sons marched off to die for kings they'd never chosen. The women who had no place in any calculus of power except as pawns in marriages arranged to seal alliances. He had not come to Westeros to play the Game of Thrones. He had come, insofar as he'd come anywhere intentionally, given that the anomaly had been entirely outside his control, to demonstrate what happened to games like this when someone refused to play by their rules. The Iron Throne still stood in its great hall, but Magneto was in King's Landing now, and he was paying attention, and every lord and schemer who'd built their power on iron was about to discover what that meant. The game, he decided, walking back through the pre-dawn streets to the modest rooms he'd taken near the Street of Steel, was about to have a new player. And unlike all the others, he had not the slightest interest in sitting on that throne. What he intended to do with it was far more permanent. Daenerys Targaryen had been told her entire life that she was owed something. The throne, the kingdom, the destiny written in her bloodline and her dragons and the particular fire that lived behind her violet eyes. She had crossed a sea, freed slaves, burned cities, and buried people she loved, all in service of a claim that had been impressed upon her before she was old enough to question whether she wanted it. Magneto, sitting across from her in the pavilion outside Meereen, thought he recognized the shape of that burden. He had come to her because the logic was unavoidable. Two exiles, two people who had been dispossessed of everything by systems that believed they had the right to decide who deserved power and who deserved chains. He had crossed the narrow sea on his own, floating above the water in the pre-dawn dark. The salt air sharp against his face, because every piece of intelligence he'd gathered in King's Landing pointed here. The Dragon Queen was the variable that none of the players in Westeros had fully accounted for. Neither had he until now. She received him in full ceremonial mode. The white gown, the three dragons visible in the sky above like circling promises. The Dothraki and Unsullied, arranged with the careful theatrics of someone who had learned that power was partially performance. He respected the stagecraft even as he saw through it. She studied him with those unsettling eyes. They say you flew here, across the sea, without a ship. Yes. How? The same way your dragons fly, he said, except mine is a gift I was born with, not one I hatched. A silence. One of the dragons, the largest, the black one, landed heavily at the pavilion's edge and regarded him with yellow eyes the size of shields. Magneto looked back at it without flinching, extending his senses gently outward, feeling the iron in its blood, the trace minerals in its impossibly dense bones. Remarkable animal. Drogon won't usually tolerate strangers, Daenerys said, and there was something careful in her voice. I'm not threatening him, Magneto said. I'm introducing myself. The conversation that followed lasted 4 hours. He told her the truth about where he came from. Not all of it, but enough. Another world, a civilization with different weapons and different cruelties, but recognizable patterns of oppression. He had spent his life fighting for people who were different, who were feared, who were owned or caged or killed by those who thought difference was a disease. She listened without interrupting, which told him she was serious. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the sun was setting over Slaver's Bay, painting the water in shades of copper and blood. You came to Westeros for a reason, she said, not a question. I came to Westeros because the universe deposited me there, he said. I stayed because I saw something familiar, a continent that has been enslaved to a single idea for thousands of years, that certain people are born to rule and everyone else is born to serve. Your Iron Throne is just the most honest version of that idea. At least it's made of weapons. At least it admits what it is. Something moved in her face. He'd struck something real. That's why I want it, she said quietly. To break the wheel. That's what I told. She stopped. A grief flickered and was suppressed. Someone she'd lost. He didn't press. Breaking the wheel, he said, is harder than it sounds. I've been trying to break a version of it my entire life. The wheel has a way of rebuilding itself. You melt down the throne, and someone builds a new one. You execute the masters, and a generation later, their children's children are running the same systems with different names. Then what do you suggest? He leaned forward. I suggest we stop thinking about who sits on the throne and start thinking about why the throne exists at all, who it serves, what it requires of the people beneath it. He paused. I also suggest we discuss the North, and what's coming from beyond the wall. That got her full attention. He had learned about the White Walkers the same way he'd learned everything else in Westeros, by listening to the people everyone else ignored. Not the lords, not the maesters with their careful skepticism and their institutional investment in the idea that the world was explicable and containable. He'd listened to the refugees, the wildlings who'd come south with desperate eyes and stories that the lords of the realm were busy dismissing, because the alternative, taking them seriously, was too expensive and too frightening. An army of the dead, animated by something cold and ancient and entirely beyond the political calculations of every player in the Game of Thrones. He had taken it seriously immediately, because he had learned the hard way that the threats people chose not to believe in were the ones that killed them. The dead don't negotiate, he told Daenerys. They don't want the throne. They don't want gold or grain or marriage alliances. Whatever is driving them has a single objective, and every person playing politics in King's Landing is going to be part of its army if someone doesn't stop it. Jon Snow has been saying the same thing, she said carefully. Jon Snow, he said, appears to be one of the few people in this world thinking clearly. I'd like to meet him. She made him wait 3 days, which he understood was a test. He used the time to walk through Meereen, the city she was trying to hold together through a combination of military occupation and political compromise that was slowly bleeding her support in both directions. He saw the former slaves navigating the complex shame of people whose liberation had arrived from outside, delivered by a foreign conqueror with dragons. He saw the master's children growing up in reduced circumstances, nursing resentments that would calcify into the next generation's cruelties if nothing was done. He saw the sons of the Harpy graffiti on the walls and understood. You could free people from chains and still leave the ideology of the chains entirely intact. He had made this mistake himself, taken physical freedom by force without changing the structures that made captivity possible. The lesson had cost him enormously. On the second day, he found the blacksmith's quarter and spent an afternoon talking to a man who made weapons for Daenerys' armies. The man had been a slave. He worked with the practiced dissociation of someone who had learned to be invisible, to take up as little space as possible, to make himself easy to overlook. Magneto sat on an upturned bucket and watched him work and thought about how much of the world's suffering was just this. People who had been taught that their smallness was natural, inevitable, even deserved. On the third day, he was brought to Jon Snow. Jon Snow was younger than he'd expected and older than he looked, which Magneto recognized as the specific aging that happened to people who had survived things they shouldn't have survived. They met in a stone room with maps on the table, and the smell of cold coming off the young man's furs like a second presence. He had northern eyes, gray, direct, uncomfortable with performance. He looked at Magneto the way soldiers looked at each other, not measuring rank or wealth, but something more essential: capacity, intention. "She says you flew here from Westeros," Jon said. "Yes. And you believe what I've been saying about the dead?" "I believe the people I spoke to who came south through the wall. I have no reason to doubt them, and considerable experience with institutions that suppress inconvenient truths." He paused. "I also believe that whatever animates your White Walkers, it responds to the cold. And cold is fundamentally a material phenomenon. Molecules slowing. It's entropy in a specific direction." He looked at the maps. "Everything that exists in this world has a physical substrate. That includes your enemy." Jon was quiet. "Most people think I'm mad." "Most people," Magneto said, "have never seen what I've seen." He glanced at the map marking the wall, the vast white nothing beyond it. "I've fought enemies that seemed supernatural. They always turned out to be science the frightened hadn't bothered to understand yet." He tapped the map. "Tell me everything. Start from the beginning." Jon talked for 2 hours. Magneto listened with the focused attention he reserved for intelligence that actually mattered, asking precise questions, building a model in his mind: the Night King's apparent hierarchy, the behavior of the Whites, the reanimated dead, the dragon glass and Valyrian steel, the only materials that seemed to destroy White Walkers permanently. Dragon glass was obsidian, volcanic glass. He filed that away. Valyrian steel was the more interesting problem, a metal with properties that didn't conform to any metallurgical logic he recognized. The folding process, the spells alleged to be woven into it. He would need to examine a blade. He would need to understand whether what made it effective was the material composition or something else, something that his powers might or might not be able to replicate or amplify. "You're thinking about how to use your ability against them," Jon said. He was perceptive. "I'm thinking about what the Night King is made of," Magneto said. "Whether he carries iron in his body the way living creatures do. Whether there's enough ferrous material in an army of the dead to give me purchase on them." He paused. "I don't know yet, but I intend to find out." Jon looked at him for a long moment. "Why? This isn't your world." It was a fair question, the fairest question anyone had asked him since he arrived. "Because I have spent my entire life watching people decide that certain lives were expendable," Magneto said quietly, "that some populations could be sacrificed to the logic of someone else's power. Your Night King is just the most honest version of that impulse. He wants everything dead." He stood straightening the collar of his coat. "I find that clarifying. It simplifies the politics considerably." That night, alone on the roof of the pyramid, with Meereen spread below him and the stars of an alien sky overhead, he made a decision. And he had come to Westeros to break the wheel, as Daenerys put it, but there would be nothing left to free if the dead reached the south before anyone was ready. 2 threats then: the Ancient One beyond the wall and the Ancient One built into the throne room in King's Landing. He could feel the Iron Throne from here, impossibly far away, a distant magnetic whisper. All those swords, all that iron, waiting. He would deal with the dead first, and then he would come home to that throne and finish what he'd come to Westeros to do. The wheel, he thought, had been turning for 10,000 years. It was almost out of time. He heard the wall before he saw it, not with his ears. The thing was 300 miles away when he first felt it, a faint structural hum at the edge of his perception, the way a tuning fork's vibration travels through a table and into your fingertips before you consciously register the sound. 700 feet of ice, compressed over thousands of years into something harder than most stone, threaded through with minerals and ancient sediment, and this was the part that made him slow his flight and extend his senses with careful attention. Something else. Something that felt almost magnetic. A pulse deep in the ice, rhythmic and cold and very, very old. He had been flying north for 2 days, following the King's Road until it thinned and then disappeared. Watching the landscape beneath him transform from the tentative green of late autumn into the iron gray and white of a winter that had apparently been threatening for years, and was now finally arriving with conviction. He passed over abandoned villages. Their roofs collapsed under early snow. Their inhabitants fled south or dead where they stood. He passed over the frozen bodies of wildlings who hadn't made it through the passes. He passed over a battlefield, weeks old, the blood black and frozen into the ground, where the dead had clearly won. Castle Black was smaller than he'd expected. Everything in this world was simultaneously more dramatic and more shabby than its reputation suggested. The great castles were cold and leaking. The great armies were hungry and poorly supplied. The great political players were exhausted people making desperate decisions in drafty rooms. Castle Black fit the pattern. A collection of dark stone buildings huddled against the base of the wall, like a man leaning into wind, populated by fewer men than its structure suggested it was built to house. He landed in the courtyard. The Night's Watchmen who saw him arrive, a gray-haired man in strange clothes descending from the sky without wings or dragon, went through several rapid emotional stages. Terror, confusion, the specific resigned exhaustion of people who had already seen too many impossible things to invest heavily in one more. A man with a scarred face and careful eyes came forward. Dolorous Ed, he would learn, acting Lord Commander. "You'd be the one Jon Snow sent word about," Ed said. "Yes." Ed looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man performing complex internal calculations about threat assessment and hospitality requirements. "Right," he said finally. "There's Stu." He spent the first day studying the wall. Up close it was extraordinary. A structure on a scale that had no equivalent in the medieval technology supposedly available when it was built, which told him immediately that the Maester's official history was either incomplete or wrong. Something else had shaped this. The magnetic irregularities he'd felt from a distance were stronger here, layered into the ice in patterns that felt almost intentional, like a circuit board made of frozen water and ancient intention. He pressed his palm against the base of the wall and felt it breathe. Not literally, but the deep structural pulse he'd detected was unmistakable now. A slow, powerful oscillation, like a heartbeat at geological scale. The wall was not merely a wall, it was a mechanism. Whatever magic the legends credited to Bran the Builder, there was something physically real underneath the mythology, something that resonated with his powers in ways he didn't yet understand. He spent an hour simply listening to it. Then he climbed, not the steps, but the face of the wall itself, his fingers finding purchase in the ice by the simple method of willing the mineral traces in the surface to hold him, pulling himself up 700 feet in 20 minutes, while the Night's Watchmen watched from below with expressions ranging from awe to deep theological discomfort. From the top, he could see everything. Just to the south, the world he'd come to understand over the past weeks, complicated, cruel, political, human in all its worst and best senses. To the north, something else entirely. The haunted forest stretched to the horizon, dark and snow-laden, and absolutely still in a way that forests were not still when they were merely empty. He had spent time in genuinely empty wilderness. This stillness was different, the stillness of a held breath, of something vast and patient, waiting for the right moment. And beyond the tree line, just at the limit of vision, a movement. He stood on top of the wall in the killing cold and watched it for a long time. Then he came back down and asked Ed to tell him everything about the last ranging. The scouts came back on the third day with information in frostbite and the particular haunted quality of men who had looked at something their minds were still refusing to fully process. The army of the dead was 4 days north, moving south, not quickly. The deliberate pace of something that understood it didn't need to hurry, that the arithmetic of its situation was simply too favorable to require urgency. Every human it killed became a soldier. Every soldier it lost was a minor inconvenience. Time was entirely on its side. Magneto sat in the map room with Ed and the senior rangers and listened to the scouts' report and did the mathematics in his head. Castle Black's garrison was approximately 200 men, functioning. There were perhaps 300 more scattered across the other castles along the wall, most of which were barely operational. Jon Snow was riding north from Dragonstone with a small party to harvest dragonglass from the caches he'd identified. Daenerys was still in Essos, her armies and dragons weeks away, even if she moved immediately. 200 men against an army of the dead that reportedly numbered in the tens of thousands. He had faced worse odds. The mathematics of worse odds anyway. At Cape Citadel, he'd faced the assembled military power of two superpowers. In Genosha, he'd built something from nothing, populated entirely by people everyone else had written off. He had a specific and well-documented history of looking at situations that appeared mathematically impossible and finding the variable everyone else had missed. When he went back to the wall that night and pressed his palm against it again and thought very carefully about what he was feeling, the theory came to him at 3 a.m, standing alone in the wind. The White Walkers moved with the cold. They commanded the dead through something, some connection, some signal, some organizing intelligence emanating from the Night King through his lieutenants to the Whites in a hierarchy of control. He had watched enough of Charles's work to understand how that kind of network functioned, how you disrupted it, how you found the central node and removed it. But there was something more immediate: iron in the blood. Living creatures carried iron in their hemoglobin. This was fundamental biology, consistent across his world and apparently this one as well, not given that the living humans around him bled red. The dead, he'd been told, bled nothing. But they had once been alive. The iron was still there. Not circulating, not functional, but present. Trace amounts. Cold and still and locked in dead tissue. He had moved iron in living blood before, carefully, precisely in controlled circumstances that he preferred not to think about too often. The question was whether he could reach enough of it at once, whether he could find the iron in 10,000 dead bodies simultaneously and do something meaningful with it. He didn't know. He had never tried anything at that scale. He thought about what it would cost him. Then he thought about the villages he'd flown over, the black frozen blood on the battlefield north of the King's Road. The refugees with their children and their desperate eyes who'd come south through the wall with stories no one wanted to believe. He thought about a cattle car, the smell of it, the sound of the doors. Some things you didn't calculate, some things you simply decided. Jon Snow arrived on the 4th day with 7 men, a boat full of obsidian, and the expression of someone who had spent the journey dreading what he was going to find. What he found was Magneto standing on top of the wall again, coat whipping in the wind, looking north with the focused stillness of a man doing complex work in his head. They stood together up there in the cold, and Magneto told him what he'd worked out. Jon listened without interrupting. He had that quality, the real stillness of someone genuinely processing, rather than waiting for their turn to speak. "Hurrah, the iron in the dead," Jon said when he finished. "It won't be enough on its own," Magneto said. "Not at that scale. I can disrupt them, throw them, create enough chaos in their physical structure to stop their movement temporarily. But the Night King," he paused, "if the Whites are connected to him the way your Rangers describe, he's the node. Everything routes through him. If I can reach him..." People who've tried to reach the Night King have died. People who've tried to reach him hand to hand, yes. He turned to look at Jon. "I don't need to be near him. I need to know what he's made of, whether there's enough metal in him to give me purchase." A pause. "Your Valyrian steel sword. May I examine it?" Jon drew Longclaw and held it out without hesitation. When that gesture, the immediate trust in it, caught Magneto slightly off guard, he took the blade carefully. The steel sang under his hands. It was unlike any metal he had ever felt. The magnetic signature was wrong. Not wrong as in absent, but wrong as in other, structured in ways he had no framework for, as if the metal had been worked at a level below the atomic by someone who understood things about material physics that his world science hadn't reached yet. The legends about spells woven into Valyrian steel during forging, he had dismissed them as mythology, but standing here with the blade in his hands, he felt something that made him reassess. The metal responded to his touch like a living thing. He handed Longclaw back slowly. "The dragon glass," he said. "And this. They don't just penetrate the White Walkers. And they interact with whatever animates them. Something in the material disrupts the animating principle," he thought. "Like a counter-frequency. The right vibration destroying the wrong structure." Jon was looking at him carefully. "Can you use that?" "I don't know," Magneto said, "but I think I can learn." He spent the next 2 days doing something he rarely did, experimenting cautiously. He worked with the dragon glass and the Valyrian steel, feeling their signatures, trying to understand the physics of what made them lethal to the dead. He wasn't certain he could replicate it. The Valyrian steel especially seemed to operate on principles that exceeded his current comprehension. But the dragon glass was more accessible. Obsidian, volcanic glass, brittle, non-metallic, not within his power to control directly. But metal could propel it, and metal could be made very, very sharp. He found the castle black armory and spent an afternoon working quietly, the Night's Watch men giving him a wide berth, while he did things to their conventional iron weapons that violated most of what this world believed about what a man could do with metal in his bare hands. Ed came in at one point, looked at what was happening, and left without speaking. When he was done, he had something that might work. Might. He stood at the base of the wall in the gathering dark and looked at what he'd made and felt the specific cold clarity that came over him when the planning phase ended, and what remained was simply the thing itself. The dead were 2 days away. He was not what this world would have called a hero. He had never been interested in that word. But he had spent his entire life refusing to let the machinery of extinction run unopposed. The wall hummed against his back, ancient and cold and secretly, mysteriously alive. He put his hand against it one more time. Hold, he thought, not sure if the instruction was for the ice or for himself. The wall said nothing, but it didn't fall. They came at dawn, not with war cries or drum beats or any of the theatrical noise that living armies use to frighten their enemies and steady their own nerves. They came in silence, which was worse, a vast, patient silence that moved through the trees like weather, like the cold itself had learned to walk. The forest north of the wall stopped making sound approximately an hour before the first white broke the tree line. Every animal in it either fled or frozen or already dead and walking somewhere in the mass behind. Magneto stood on top of the wall and watched them come. He had been standing there for 2 hours since the ranging party's raven arrived with the single word the Night's Watch used for this specific contingency. A word so old most of the men had never expected to use it in their lifetimes. Watch had repeated it in training like liturgy without believing it would ever be necessary. Dead. Below him, Castle Black was doing the grim arithmetic of 200 men preparing for a number they couldn't count. John had distributed the dragon glass weapons, arrowheads, spear points, knives, with the methodical calm of someone rationing the last of something irreplaceable. The Night's Watch archers were at the wall's southern face, ready to descend through the tunnels if the gate was breached. Ed had sent ravens south an hour ago, which both of them understood was hope rather than strategy. No one was coming in time. The dead reached the tree line and kept coming. He had understood intellectually that the numbers were enormous. Seeing it was different. They emerged from the forest in a wave that had no visible end. Not running, not marching, simply moving with the relentless patience of water, finding the lowest point. Filling the space before the wall from tree line to tree line, tens of thousands of bodies in various states of preservation, their eyes blue-white in the pre-dawn dark, making no sound except the collective crush of frozen feet on frozen ground. Behind them, elevated on a ridge where he could observe without being touched, the Night King. Magneto had expected something monstrous. What he saw was almost worse. A figure of terrible stillness, armored in what appeared to be ice, carrying no weapon, needing none. The commanding officer of an army that had already won every battle it had ever fought. He sat on a dead horse and watched his army move with the detached attention of someone observing a process rather than commanding one. Magneto extended his senses toward him. Iron. Yes. Trace amounts. Deep in a body that had been something else before it was this. Human once, impossibly long ago, transformed into whatever it was now through a process he didn't have the framework to fully understand. The magnetic signature was strange. The same wrongness he'd felt in the Valyrian steel, but inverted, like a photographic negative of something living. Enough to grip. Possibly. He filed that away and turned his attention to the army. He had worked out a sequence during the 2 days of preparation, the same way he'd worked out sequences his entire life. Not a plan exactly, because plans assumed a cooperative environment, and nothing about this was cooperative, but a priority structure. A decision tree for when the situation degraded past each threshold. First, the wall. He'd spent the previous day doing something to the wall's iron fixtures. The great hinges of the gate, the metal brackets holding the winching mechanisms, the chains and pulleys of the elevator. That went considerably beyond maintenance. Every piece of iron in the wall's infrastructure was now an extension of his awareness, a sensory network that covered the full width of the structure. If anything touched the gate with intent, he would feel it the way he felt his own hands. Second, the field. He had never attempted what he was about to attempt at scale. The iron in 10,000 dead bodies. Cold and still, trace amounts, nothing like the living blood that sang so clearly to him in the men standing on the wall below. Was faint, almost below his threshold of perception, but almost was not the same as impossible. And he had spent 2 nights pushing at that boundary, learning its texture, finding what leverage was available. Not enough to stop them. He'd been honest with himself about that. Enough to hurt them. Enough to buy time. Third, the Night King. He put that thought away for later. He descended from the top of the wall on the outside, dropping in controlled stages, slowing himself with metal brackets, and landed 50 feet in front of the gate as the first whites reached the killing ground before the wall. Jon appeared beside him. He hadn't asked the man to come. He also hadn't told him not to. "You should be inside," Magneto said. "So should you," Jon said, and drew Longclaw. The dead reached them. What happened next was not graceful. It was not the clean, cinematic violence of someone operating within their limits. It was Magneto at the absolute edge of what he could do, pushing past that edge by will and fury, and the particular controlled desperation of someone who has decided that the cost doesn't matter. He reached into the mass of dead bodies and found the iron and pulled. The effect was not what he'd hoped for and not as bad as he'd feared. The nearest 200 whites lurched, stumbled, some of them folding as the trace iron in their bodies responded to his command. Not cleanly, not precisely, but enough to break their forward momentum, to create stuttering disruption in the front lines that spread backward in confused waves. Those with weapons found the weapons turning in their hands, blades angling toward their own bodies or their neighbors. Jon moved through the disrupted lines with the terrible efficiency of someone who had been fighting the dead long enough to stop being afraid of them. Longclaw's Valyrian steel did its work. Every white it touched coming apart at the point of contact, the animating principle severed cleanly. But the dead were endless, and the 2 of them were not. The first hour was brutal. Magneto fought in a way he hadn't fought in years, without restraint, without the careful calibration he'd learned to apply in a world with political consequences and allies who were watching. Here there was nothing to calibrate. The dead didn't suffer. The dead didn't have civilians mixed among them. Every white that fell was subtracted from a number that needed to reach 0, and the only question was how much of himself he spent getting there. And he found new applications by necessity. The arrowheads on the wall, he could guide them with magnetic precision, turn Night's Watch arrows into something approaching guided weapons, each obsidian-tipped shaft finding the skull or neck that would stop a white. He burned through the Night's Watch's arrow supply in 20 minutes and started working with the iron in the whites' own weapons, turning their blades against each other in cascading chain reactions that took down clusters of 5, 8, 12 at a time. The wall held, but the Night King hadn't moved yet. Magneto was aware of him the whole time. That cold, strange magnetic signature on the ridge. Watching, evaluating. Waiting for the moment when the human defenders had spent enough of themselves that the outcome became arithmetically certain. Smart, patient, old. The thing about old, patient, smart enemies, Magneto thought, deflecting a white's axe and driving it through 3 of its neighbors, was that they forgot to account for the possibility that someone on the other side had also been doing this for a very long time. He pulled back toward the gate in the second hour, not because he was losing. The wall still stood. The dead still hadn't breached the gate, but because he needed a moment to think, and thinking in the middle of 10,000 dead bodies was genuinely difficult. Jon fought his way back alongside him. He was bleeding from a cut along his jaw, his furs torn, but his eyes were clear. He'd been counting. "He's going to move soon," Jon said, "when he thinks we're exhausted." "I know. What he does when he moves." Jon paused. He raised the dead at Hardhome. "Everybody on the field, all at once." Magneto looked at the killing ground before the wall. The whites they destroyed lay in scattered pieces. Not a small number. A significant number, actually. He'd been more effective than he'd feared, which meant there were bodies on the field, which meant if the Night King raised them, "Get every man off the killing ground," he said. "Now." Jon didn't ask questions. He turned and ran back toward the gate, shouting. Magneto turned to face the ridge. The Night King had moved. He was descending toward the field on his dead horse. alone, with the unhurried confidence of someone who had already calculated the outcome. His lieutenants, the White Walkers, ice-armored and ancient, spread to either side of him. Magneto walked forward to meet him. The distance closed. When around him, the dead parted. Not because they feared him, he understood, but because the Night King's focus had settled on him with a specificity that displaced all other instructions. He was being evaluated, identified as the variable that had disrupted the arithmetic. They stopped 30 feet apart. The Night King raised one hand. On the killing ground, the bodies of the destroyed whites began to move. Magneto had been ready for this. He reached out to every piece of metal on the field, fragments of weapons, arrowheads, the iron fittings of broken shields, and held them in a precise suspended configuration, a web of sharp metal hovering 6 inches above the ground across the entire killing field. When the reanimated dead tried to rise, they rose into it. Not all of them stopped, but enough. The Night King lowered his hand. They looked at each other. No language, no negotiation. That had been the wrong hope. He'd known it was the wrong hope, but some part of him had needed to arrive here and confirm it personally. There was nothing behind those blue eyes that wanted anything except the end of everything warm. He thought about the wall, the magnetic pulse deep in the ice, the way the Valyrian steel had responded to his touch. He thought about what it would cost him. He reached out toward the Night King and found the iron in the strange inverted wrongness of his magnetic signature, and did something he had never done before. Not pulling, not pushing, but disrupting. Finding the frequency of that signal and introducing interference at a level that went below the structural, below the physical, out down into whatever layer of reality the animating principle of the White Walkers actually operated on. The Night King staggered. It was small, it was momentary, but in all the recorded history of anyone who had faced the Night King, Magneto suspected he had never staggered. The White Walker lieutenants moved. Magneto raised every piece of metal on the field and went to meet them. He won. That felt important to state plainly, without the narrative hedging of Barely or Pyrrhic. He won. The White Walker lieutenants fell, not easily, not without cost, the disruption technique requiring a sustained focus that left him on his knees by the end, blood from his nose pattering onto the frozen ground. But they fell, and when they fell, the whites connected to them collapsed like cut strings, among thousands of dead bodies dropping simultaneously in a sound like the world exhaling. The Night King retreated, not destroyed, not defeated permanently, but retreated. Jon stood beside him in the sudden silence and looked at the field of fallen dead and said nothing for a long time. "He'll come back," Jon finally said. "Yes," Magneto said. He straightened, wiped his face, looked north at the tree line where the Night King had disappeared. But now he knows something he didn't know before. "What's that?" Magneto looked at him. "That he can be hurt." Above them, the wall hummed in the cold. Ancient, patient, still standing. Behind them, Castle Black was very, very quiet. Cersei Lannister had not survived this long by waiting for threats to come to her. She had survived by identifying them early, correctly, and acting before they understood they were in danger. She had survived Ned Stark's honor and Robert's contempt, and Tyrion's cleverness, and Marguerite Tyrell's careful smiling patience. She had survived the loss of her children, which was the thing that should have broken her, and instead had simply removed the last restraint on what she was willing to do. Every person who had underestimated her was either dead or irrelevant, which in Westeros was often the same thing. She had received the ravens from the wall with the careful attention she gave to all intelligence, which meant she had read them 3 times and then sat alone for an hour thinking about what they meant. A man who flew without wings or dragon, who moved metal with his bare hands, who had walked out in front of an army of the dead and made them fall. The small council had predictable reactions. Qyburn found it fascinating. She could see the hunger in his eyes, the particular acquisitive gleam of a man who saw everything as material for his experiments. The military advisors were afraid, which was useless. The rest were busy deciding whether to believe it, which was even more useless. Cersei had stopped asking whether to believe things a long time ago. She asked only, "What does this mean for me, and what do I do about it?" What it meant was this. Somewhere between the Wall and King's Landing, a man was riding south who had just demonstrated that he was more powerful than any single asset currently on the board. She's more powerful than her armies, possibly more powerful than dragons, though that equation remained untested. What she intended to do about it was considerably more interesting than what her advisors suggested. He arrived in King's Landing 12 days after the wall. She watched him come through the city from a window. Not the obvious window, not the one that announced her observation, but a narrow aperture in a servant's passage that gave her a clear view of the street below without offering herself as a visible presence. She had learned to watch from concealment as a child, in the years when being seen meant being moved like a piece on someone else's board. He moved through the crowd without a retinue, without guards, without the performance of importance that every powerful man she'd ever known felt compelled to stage. Well, people stepped aside for him anyway. Not because they recognized him, but because of something in his bearing, the quality of a man who had decided a very long time ago that the world would accommodate him or he would rearrange it until it did. He was older than she'd imagined. The gray at his temples, the economy of his movements. This was not a young man's power. This was something that had been refined over decades of use, worn smooth by long practice into something that no longer needed to announce itself. She found him, unexpectedly, interesting. He came to her that evening. Not summoned, she had sent no invitation, had given no indication of her interest. He simply arrived at the keep, was admitted by guards who would later be unable to explain precisely why they'd stepped aside, and appeared in her receiving chamber as if he'd been expected. She was sitting by the window with wine she was actually drinking this time, which was how he would know, if he was observant, that she'd decided on a particular approach. He was observant. She saw him clock the wine immediately. "You've been watching me since I entered the city," he said. Not an accusation, a statement of fact, offered to establish the terms of the conversation. "I watch everything," she said. "Sit down." He sat. He looked around the room with the methodical attention of someone cataloging exits and threats and structural features, and then he looked at her with the same attention, and she had the uncomfortable experience of feeling genuinely assessed rather than desired or feared or politically evaluated, which were the three modes in which men generally looked at her. "You want something from me," he said. "Everyone wants something from you at this point," she said. "The question is who offers you something worth having in return. And what do you think I want?" She considered the question seriously, which she suspected he'd appreciate. "Not the throne," she said. "You've had 2 opportunities to take it and show no interest. Not gold. You have no use for it and no allegiance to any house it could buy. Not safety. A man who walked into an army of the dead doesn't organize his choices around personal safety." She paused. "You want to change something. Fundamentally, not who sits on the throne, but what the throne means." She tilted her head. "I find that either admirable or catastrophically naive. And I haven't decided which." Something moved in his expression. Not quite surprise, but the recalibration of someone revising an estimate upward. "You're more perceptive than your reputation suggests," he said. "My reputation was written by men," she said. "They emphasized the parts that frightened them and omitted the parts they couldn't understand." They talked for 3 hours. Not negotiated, talked, which was different. She had conducted 10,000 negotiations in this room and in rooms like it, and she knew the difference between 2 people positioning and 2 people genuinely trying to understand each other's architecture. This was the latter, which surprised her, and she suspected surprised him as well. He told her more about where he came from than he told anyone else, she sensed. And not everything. There were careful omissions, walls she could feel without being able to see them. But enough. A world with different weapons and different hierarchies, and the same fundamental machinery of oppression, running on the same fuel of fear and tribalism and the will to dominate. She told him things she hadn't told Jaime, about what it was like to be intelligent in a world that treated female intelligence as either a tool to be used or a threat to be managed. About what she'd understood from girlhood, that the game was real and permanent and indifferent to whether you wanted to play, that the only choice was between playing well and losing badly. "You built your power inside a system designed to exclude you," he said, "and then you used that power to defend the system." It was a critique. She received it without flinching, because she'd thought the same thing herself, alone, in the hours after her children died. "The system protected my children," she said, "while they lived. And when they didn't," a silence, "I protected myself she said. Which is what's left. He looked at her for a long moment with something that wasn't sympathy exactly. He didn't strike her as a man who did sympathy, but was perhaps recognition. The specific acknowledgement of someone who had also made choices in the ruins of everything they were protecting. Qyburn came to her the next morning with a proposal. She had expected it. He was constitutionally incapable of being in proximity to a new power without immediately designing an experiment to understand, replicate, or neutralize it. He laid out his thinking in the precise, bloodless way he laid out everything. The possibility of studying the mechanism of the man's ability, of identifying its limits and vulnerabilities, of extracting what could be extracted and then... No, she said. Qyburn paused. My queen... He stopped the dead, Qyburn. She turned from the window. The dead that are still north of the wall, still building numbers, still moving south. She looked at him with the patience she reserved for men who were brilliant at details and poor at scale. Whatever you could learn from dissecting him would not be worth being on the wrong side of what's coming. There are contingencies. There are always contingencies, she said. Plan one anyway. Keep it away from me. And do nothing without my explicit instruction. After he left, she stood at the window and looked at the city below and thought about the conversation last night, about what he'd said regarding the wheel. She had spent her entire life as a gear in the wheel, a powerful one, a well-positioned one, but a gear nonetheless. Her motion determined by the motion of everything around her, her choices constrained by the architecture she'd been born into. She was not naive enough to think that what he was proposing was simple or safe or even possible. She had seen too many idealists ground to nothing by the wheels turning. But she had also never met anyone who gave her a genuine reason to consider that the wheel might be stoppable. He found her in the throne room that night. She hadn't told him she would be there. She hadn't told anyone. She came sometimes alone in the dark, when the weight of everything required a specific kind of confrontation with the thing she was fighting to hold. He was already there when she arrived. Standing before the Iron Throne in the darkness, one hand extended but not quite touching it, his eyes closed and his head tilted slightly as if listening to something she couldn't hear. She stopped in the doorway. You can feel it, she said quietly. Every sword, he said, every blade, their individual histories, the way the metal remembers the forge. He opened his eyes and looked at the throne without the reverence or the hunger she was used to seeing in people who stood before it. How many people died for this? Everyone dies for it eventually, she said. Or because of it. He turned to look at her. In the darkness of the throne room, his eyes were very clear. I told you I came here to change something fundamental. I want you to understand what I mean by that. Show me, she said. He turned back to the throne and raised his hand. The Iron Throne moved. Not violently. Not the explosion of destruction she'd half expected. It rose from the dais slowly, with the deliberate grace of something being examined rather than attacked, rotating in the air 3 feet above where it had sat for 300 years. In the torchlight, she could see it properly for the first time. Not as a symbol, not as an object of desire or power, but as what it actually was. Swords. Hundreds of badly made swords, welded into a shape no one could sit in comfortably. A monument to the idea that power was supposed to hurt. Yeah, and I could destroy it right now, he said quietly. Reduce it to a ball of scrap in under a minute. She believed him completely. But you won't, she said. Not tonight. The throne descended back to the dais with perfect, precise gentleness. Because I need you to understand what I'm going to do and to choose whether you're part of it. Not as an asset, not as a piece on a board. He turned to face her fully. As someone who decides. Cersei Lannister stood in the dark throne room and looked at the Iron Throne and felt something she had not felt in years, possibly ever. Something that felt dangerously close to the possibility that the game she'd been playing her entire life was not the only game available. Tell me, she said. Daenerys Targaryen's fleet arrived at Dragonstone on a gray morning, with the sea running heavy and the sky the color of old iron. She stood at the prow of her flagship and looked at the ancestral seat of her family, the volcanic island fortress that Aegon the Conqueror had used as his staging ground before burning his way across a continent, and felt the complex mixture of homecoming and foreignness that had followed her everywhere since she'd left Essos. Every place she'd ever belonged to had required her to conquer it first. She was beginning to suspect that was less a feature of her specific circumstances and more a structural truth about what it meant to be her. Tyrion stood beside her, reading the ravens that had been waiting at Dragonstone with the focused speed of a man who understood that political situations did not pause for sea voyages. He read 3 ravens in silence. Then he read a 4th and said nothing for long enough that she turned to look at him. "Tell me," she said. "The man from the wall," Tyrion said carefully. "Erik Lehnsherr. He's been in King's Landing for 11 days. A pause. "He's been meeting with Cersei." The dragon Drogon, circling overhead, caught some shift in her mood and wheeled closer. She steadied herself deliberately, the discipline of years. "Alone?" "Repeatedly." Tyrion set the raven down. "My sources in the keep say the conversations last hours. Qyburn has been excluded. The mountain has not been deployed." He paused again, with the specific hesitation of a man choosing his framing carefully. "Whatever is happening between them, it isn't what Cersei usually does with assets or threats." Daenerys looked at Dragonstone and thought about the conversation she'd had with Magneto and Meereen, about broken wheels and the structures underneath power, about exiles who understood each other. She thought about the fact that she had told him things about herself in that pavilion outside Meereen that she hadn't told Tyrion. "Send a raven," she said. "Tell him I've arrived." He came to Dragonstone 3 days later, which she understood as a statement. Not 3 hours, not 3 weeks, but 3 days, the interval of someone with other priorities who nonetheless considered her worth prompt attention. He arrived by air, might which her Dothraki blood riders watched with the open fascination of men who had grown up respecting power in all its forms and recognized something genuinely new. The Unsullied tracked him with professional attention, but did not reach for weapons. She had given specific instructions. He landed on the cliff path and walked up to the castle like a man arriving for a scheduled meeting. She received him in the chamber of the painted table, Aegon's war room, the great map of Westeros carved in stone, the strategic heart of everything her family had built. She stood at the table rather than sitting, which was a choice about equality rather than ceremony. He looked at the map for a long moment before he looked at her. "You've been talking to Cersei," she said. No preamble. "Yes." "About what?" He moved to the table and looked at the carved coastlines and the painted keeps and the tiny stone markers representing armies. "About the same things I talked to you about in Meereen. What's wrong with the system? What would have to change for the change to mean something?" He looked up. "She's more intelligent than her reputation." Her reputation was written by men, Daenerys said, and heard the echo of something, some conversation she hadn't been present for. Something shifted in his expression. She said the same thing. A silence that was full of subtext neither of them immediately addressed. "You're not here to play one of us against the other," Daenerys said. It wasn't quite a question. "No." "Then what are you doing?" He pulled out a chair and sat down without being invited, and which she had stopped finding presumptuous in him because it was clearly simply how he moved through spaces. Not disrespect, but the complete absence of the performance of deference that had always struck her as a kind of lie anyway. "I'm trying to find out if there are 2 people in this world intelligent enough and powerful enough to do something that has never been done here," he said. "Not conquer Westeros. Conquer the idea that Westeros has to work the way it's always worked." Daenerys sat down across from him. "Tell me what you propose to her," she said. He talked for an hour. The architecture of it was more developed than what he'd outlined in Meereen. He'd had weeks of immersion in Westeros's political reality. Conversations with Cersei and Jon, and the men of the Night's Watch, and the refugees and the blacksmiths, and the small folk of King's Landing, and he'd synthesized all of it into something that was less a plan than a framework. A set of principles that could generate plans. The Night King first. That was non-negotiable and immediate. The dead were not a political problem to be managed. They were an extinction event to be stopped, and everything else was secondary to that. But after. After was where it got interesting. He talked about the small folk the way nobody in this room had ever heard anyone talk about the small folk. Not as a resource, not as a constituency to be managed, not as the passive recipients of good governance, but as the actual substrate of everything. The people who grew the food and made the weapons and built the castles and raised the children and whose labor and blood and lives were the actual material from which every great house had constructed its power. He talked about the Lord's relationship to that substrate with a clarity that was uncomfortable precisely because it was accurate. Daenerys found herself leaning forward. "You're describing what I've been trying to do," she said. "Break the wheel." "I'm describing what breaking the wheel actually requires," he said. "Not a new person sitting on the old throne with better intentions. The removal of the conditions that make the wheel possible." He looked at her steadily, "which means the Lord's, the system of inherited power. The assumption that certain families own the land and everyone born on it. That's not reform," she said. "That's revolution." "Yes," he said simply. She thought about Meereen, about the masters and the freed slaves and the sons of the harpy and the fundamental impossibility of liberating people while leaving the ideology of their captivity intact. About all the lessons she'd learned in Essos that her advisors kept suggesting she set aside now that she was in Westeros, as if the principles of power changed depending on which continent you were standing on. "Cersei agreed to this?" she said. "Cersei is considering it," he said, which from Cersei is approximately the same thing. She flew to King's Landing the next morning on Drogon, not with an army, not with the Unsullied or the Dothraki or the fleet arranged in threatening formation in the harbor. She flew alone, or as alone as a woman on a dragon could be, and landed in the courtyard of the Red Keep in a way that was simultaneously impossible to ignore and carefully not an invasion. Cersei received her in a room that was neither the throne room nor a private chamber, a middle space, a meeting space, chosen with the precision Daenerys had come to expect from everything Cersei did. They looked at each other. Daenerys had imagined this meeting many times, had scripted versions of it in her head during the long sea crossing from Essos, versions where Cersei was defiant, where she was broken, where she surrendered with dignity or without it. She had not imagined a version where Cersei Lannister looked at her across a table with the expression of someone who had recently been presented with a genuinely new idea and was still in the process of deciding what to do with it. "You're not what the stories say," Cersei said. "Neither are you," Daenerys said, a silence that was almost, not quite, but almost, the beginning of something. "He told you what he proposed," Cersei said. "Yes. And you came here without your armies, which means you're either very confident or very naive. Or I understood that arriving with an army would have confirmed every story you'd been told about me," Daenerys said, "and made the conversation we need to have impossible." Cersei was quiet. She moved to the window. The same window, Daenerys would later understand, from which she'd watched Magneto walk through the city, the habit of observing from concealment. "My son is dead," Cersei said, without turning from the window. "My daughter, my other son, everyone I did any of this for." A pause. "I have been protecting a succession that no longer exists, holding a throne for children who are gone." She turned. Her face was composed with the immaculate control of someone who had been performing composure for so long it had become structural. "He asked me what I actually want, not what I'm fighting for, what I want." "What did you say?" Daenerys asked quietly. "I told him I wanted it to have meant something." A pause. "Joffrey and Myrcella and Tommen. Hodori, I wanted their deaths to have meant something other than the random cruelty of a game that chews up everyone eventually." Daenerys thought about Khal Drogo, about Rhaego, her son who had never drawn breath, about Ser Barristan and Jorah, and the accumulating weight of everyone the game had taken from her. "It can mean something," she said, "if we do this right." He was waiting for them in the throne room. She didn't know how he'd known to be there. Ravens, perhaps, or simply the logic of the situation, the understanding that this was where it resolved. He was standing before the Iron Throne again, hands clasped behind his back, looking at it with the focused attention of a man who had been thinking about a problem for a long time and had finally arrived at the solution. The three of them stood before the throne in the torchlight. The Dragon Queen, the Lion Queen, and the man from another world who had looked at Westeros and seen the machinery underneath the mythology. "The dead first," he said, without turning. "The Night King is adapting. He'll come south before the first thaw. We have weeks, not months." "My dragons," Daenerys said, "and your ability against him." "And Jon's knowledge," he said. "He understands the Night King's patterns in ways none of us do. He turned to look at them both. After the dead, we come back here, and we finish the other thing. Cersei looked at the Iron Throne, at the swords of defeated enemies twisted into the shape of absolute power, at 300 years of the wheels turning made physical. You could simply destroy it, she said. You've been able to since you arrived. I could, he said, but if I destroy it alone, I'm just the most powerful man in the room imposing his preference. The point isn't the throne. He looked at both of them. The point is the choice. Two queens and the men and women of this continent deciding together that they're done with it. He paused. That means something different than me reducing it to scrap in the night. Daenerys looked at the throne. She had crossed a sea and raised dragons and freed slaves and lost everything she'd loved for the chance to sit in that chair. The want of it had been the organizing principle of her entire adult life. She looked at it now and tried to identify what she actually felt. What she felt was tired. Tired of the throne and everything it required. Tired of the weight of Targaryen destiny. More tired of the game's rules and the game's costs and the fundamental lie at the center of it, that power was the point rather than the instrument. She looked at Magneto. After the dead, she said. He nodded. After the dead. Outside the throne room windows, King's Landing was going about its evening. The small folk cooking and arguing and surviving with the magnificent stubborn resilience of people who had been doing exactly that through every king and every war and every catastrophe the wheel had ever produced. The Iron Throne sat on its dais, waiting as it had always waited. For the first time in 300 years, what it was waiting for was its own ending. The cold came 3 days before the dead did. Not the ordinary cold of a Westerosi winter, which was itself extraordinary by the standards of any civilization that had not spent 10,000 years developing architectural and cultural responses to seasonal apocalypse. This was something else, a cold with intent behind it, a dropping of temperature so rapid and so total that the ground froze to a depth of 4 feet overnight and the rivers stopped mid-current and the breath of every living thing north of the neck turned to immediate ice crystal that fell rather than dispersed. Magneto felt it in his bones before he felt it in the air. The magnetic field shifted with the temperature drop. Subtle, the kind of change that instruments in his world would have required sensitive equipment to detect. But he had spent 70 years learning to read the planet's field with a precision that went beyond instrumentation. Something was happening to the electromagnetic environment. The Night King was doing something deliberate to the physical world, not merely moving through it. He told Jon. Jon's face did the thing it did when he received information that confirmed his worst existing fears. A kind of grim, unsurprised settling, like a man who had been waiting for a specific bad thing and felt something almost like relief that the waiting was over. He's done this before, Jon said. At Hardhome. The cold comes first, then he arrives, Magneto said. I know. They were standing on the walls of Winterfell, which had become the staging point for reasons both strategic and symbolic, the last great northern stronghold, the ancestral seat of the family whose name still organized northern loyalty like a compass needle finding north. Around them, the combined forces of the alliance were arranged with the careful desperation of people who had done the mathematics and understood they were still short. Daenerys' Dothraki filled the field south of Winterfell, their horses restless in the impossible cold. The Unsullied stood in their precise formations with the disciplined stillness that made them extraordinary and slightly unnerving. Cersei had sent the Golden Company, not herself, a decision they had argued about, and that Magneto had ultimately accepted, because Cersei in King's Landing, holding the political center, was genuinely more valuable than Cersei on a battlefield, along with what remained of the Lannister armies. Jon's wildling allies held the eastern flank, their knowledge of the terrain and the dead making them more useful than their numbers suggested. 2 dragons circled overhead. Drogon and Rhaegal, their wing beats felt in the chest at half a mile. Somewhere to the north, beyond sight but not beyond his perception, the Night King was moving. Sansa Stark found him at the forge on the second evening. He had been there for 6 hours, working with the castle's blacksmith on a project that had consumed most of his thinking since the wall. The blacksmith, a competent man named Micken's apprentice, the original Micken having died in the years of Lannister occupation, had stopped asking questions about what was happening to the metal under Magneto's hands and had settled into the useful role of someone who handed him things and stayed out of the way. Sansa stood in the forge doorway and watched for a moment before she spoke. "Everyone wants to know what you're making," she said. "Everyone can wait," he said, not unkindly. She came in anyway, which told him something about her. She had the stark directness without the stark tendency toward declaration. Her observations were precise, and her silences were strategic in ways that reminded him, uncomfortably, of Cersei, though the resemblance was in architecture rather than character. "You're making something to use against him," she said, watching his hands shape the metal. "When not just weapons, something specific." "Yes. Will it work?" He paused in his work and looked at her. "I don't know," he said. "I've been honest about that with everyone who's asked. Jon thinks you can stop the Night King alone. That gives the soldiers hope." She looked at him with gray eyes that had seen enough to be past the comfort of false reassurance. "I'd rather know the truth." He set down the piece he'd been working and gave her the truth. "I can disrupt him. I demonstrated that at the wall, but disruption isn't destruction, and the disruption technique cost me enormously. I was on my knees afterward, and he retreated rather than press the advantage, which is the only reason I'm standing here." He paused. "You wait if he understands what I did and adapts, if he comes south prepared for it rather than surprised by it. The calculus changes. Then what's the plan? The dragons can hurt him physically," he said. "Jon's steel can destroy his lieutenants. I can disrupt his control of the army, create openings, prevent him from raising the dead on the battlefield." He looked at the metal in his hands. "And this, if it works, gives us something we didn't have at the wall." "What?" "A way to reach him from a distance that he won't recognize as a threat until it's too late." She looked at the half-formed thing in his hands and then looked at him with the expression of someone doing rapid and competent assessment. "And if it doesn't work? Then we fall back to the dragons and hope," he said. Which is a worse plan, but not yet a plan we need." She nodded slowly. "I'll tell Jon you're confident," she said. "I told you I wasn't." "I know what you told me," she said, "and I'll tell Jon you're confident." She met his eyes. "Because right now, confidence is a resource we can't afford to waste, and I trust you to do your best work without needing to say so." She turned to leave. "Don't disappoint me." He watched her go and thought that in different circumstances, in a different world, she would have been remarkable at the specific kind of politics that required both absolute honesty and strategic management of perception simultaneously. He turned back to the forge. The dead arrived on the third night, as he'd predicted, using the dark and the cold as cover. Tactically sound, or tactically obvious to anyone who'd been paying attention. But you couldn't move an army of that size without announcing your approach to anyone sensitive enough to feel it. He felt them coming an hour before the scouts' warning bells, a vast low pressure in the magnetic field, tens of thousands of iron-bearing bodies moving in coordinated silence through the darkness north of Winterfell. He was already in position. The plan unfolded in the first hour with the deceptive smoothness that preceded catastrophe. The Dothraki charge met the whites at the field's northern edge, Arak blades flashing in the darkness. Magneto worked the Dead's Iron in sweeping disruptions that collapsed the front lines in cascading waves. Drogon and Rhaegal made their first passes, dragonfire turning the field into a strobe of orange light and black smoke. And the Night King did not appear. That was the first sign. At the wall, he'd come forward personally within the first hour, drawn by Magneto's disruption of his army, compelled by the anomaly of something that could damage him to take direct command. Here he stayed back, invisible, directing his army through his lieutenants while some new tactic, some adaptation developed in the weeks since the wall, manifested in the behavior of the dead. They were moving differently, not in the simple mass surge pattern he'd observed before. They were splitting, flowing around resistance rather than into it, finding the gaps between units with a fluid tactical intelligence that whites did not have individually. The Night King was directing each unit personally, using his connection to the dead with a precision he hadn't displayed before. He'd been studying them, learning from the wall engagement. Magneto adjusted, sweeping his disruptions wider, trying to break the coordination. But at wider scale, the disruption was thinner, less effective, the individual whites maintaining more of their function even as the coordinating signal degraded. He was spreading his effectiveness too thin. The Dothraki lines broke in the second hour, not routed, destroyed. The Dothraki did not rout. They died in the field with their weapons in their hands, which he understood was how they would have chosen it. And then they began to rise, and the arithmetic of the dead's self-replenishment made its cruel presence felt. Jon fought through the chaos with Longclaw and a small group of Stark bannermen, taking down lieutenants where he could find them. On each White Walker destroyed, collapsing the Whites under its command. It was effective and insufficient. There were more lieutenants than available Valyrian steel blades in the world. The second hour became the third hour, and the third hour became something Magneto stopped counting. He found the Night King in the fourth hour. Not physically. The Night King was still somewhere beyond the field, deliberately positioned outside the radius of what he demonstrated at the wall, directing his army from a safe distance with the adaptive intelligence of a commander who had learned from the previous engagement. Smart, patient, old, but he was connected to his army. The signal ran from him through his lieutenants to every White on the field, a hierarchical network of cold intention. And Magneto had spent 4 hours in the middle of it learning its texture with the focused attention of a man who understood that this was preparation for the one thing that actually mattered. He reached down the signal like a wire, following it back through the lieutenants, through the layered hierarchy of dead commanders, back toward its source with the delicate precision of surgery. Not disrupting yet, not announcing himself, just tracing, finding the node. There, a mile north of the field, elevated on a ridge he couldn't see but could feel with perfect clarity. The Night King and 4 of his most senior lieutenants, the old ones, the ones whose magnetic signatures were so strange and so strong they felt almost geological. He took everything he'd made in the forge and stopped holding it back. The metal he'd prepared, shaped specifically for this, configured during those 6 hours of work in Winterfell's forge into something that had no name in this world's vocabulary, left his hands at a speed that made the air crack. The Night King saw it coming. He raised his hand. The ice rose to meet it. What followed was not a clean resolution. He had promised himself, promised Sansa, in the way you kept promises made to perceptive people who would know if you broke them, that he would be honest about what he didn't know. What he didn't know was whether his disruption technique, at full intensity, applied directly to the Night King at the moment of physical impact, would be enough. It was almost enough. The metal hit the ice and the disruption fired and the Night King staggered. More than at the wall, much more. One of the strange inverted magnetic signature, fragmenting under the interference in ways that went below the physical, down into whatever layer of reality animated him. 2 of the senior lieutenants shattered without being touched. Their connection to the Night King severed so violently, the rupture destroyed them. The Night King fell to one knee. The army of the dead lurched, thousands of Whites losing coordination simultaneously, stumbling, falling, the network signal degrading into noise. Jon was already moving. He had felt the disruption from across the field, felt it in the behavior of the dead around him, the sudden incoherence, the window had opened. And he had been moving before he consciously understood why. Longclaw in his hand, Ghost running at his side, driving north through the collapsing dead lines toward the ridge. Magneto held the disruption. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. The Night King was fighting back, not physically, but at the level where the disruption operated, pushing against the interference with the ancient immovable force of something that had existed for 10,000 years and had never been stopped. He could feel it costing him, feel the edges of his consciousness fraying, the precise control required to maintain the disruption at this intensity, pulling at something fundamental. He held it. Jon reached the ridge. What happened on that ridge he did not directly see. He was on his knees in the field by then, blood on his face, the world narrowed to the single task of maintaining the disruption for one more second. One more second. One more. The dead fell, all of them, simultaneously. The sound of it was enormous. 10,000 bodies dropping at once. The collapse of an army between one breath and the next. A silence so sudden after hours of battle noise that his ears rang with it. He let the disruption go and fell forward onto his hands in the snow. Around him, Winterfell's defenders stood in stunned silence among the fallen dead, looking at each other with the particular disbelief of people who had expected to die and hadn't. He stayed on his hands and knees in the snow for a long moment, breathing. Somewhere to the north, on a ridge he couldn't see, Jon Snow stood over what remained of the Night King. The long night was over. What came after it was still to be decided. He slept for 2 days. Not the strategic rest of a commander recovering between engagements. Genuine unconscious sleep. The kind that arrives like a door closing, without warning and without negotiation. One moment he was sitting against the wall of a Winterfell storage room watching the Meister clean a cut on his forearm, and the next moment it was 43 hours later, and Sansa Stark was sitting in a chair across from him with a book in her lap and the expression of someone who had been taking shifts. He lay still for a moment before announcing he was awake, taking inventory. The inventory was not encouraging. His power was present. He could feel the iron in the room, the nails in the floorboards, the hinges on the door, the blood in the people nearby. But it felt distant, like a fire that had burned down to coals. The precision was intact. The scale was not. Whatever he'd done on that ridge, holding the disruption at full intensity against the Night King's resistance for those final minutes, had spent something that did not immediately replenish. He had felt this before. Not often. Twice in his life he'd pushed past the threshold where his power stopped being a function of will and started being a function of biology, of actual physical resource. And both times the recovery had been long and the period of diminishment had been dangerous. He was in a world he didn't fully understand, with enemies he hadn't finished dealing with, operating at perhaps 40% of normal capacity. He had survived worse odds. He opened his eyes. Sansa looked up from her book. She studied him for a moment with the diagnostic attention she applied to everything. You're awake, she said. Observant, he said. How bad? He considered lying, decided against it for the same reason he'd been honest with her before. She would know, and she would factor the lie into her future assessments of his reliability, and her assessments of reliability were clearly a resource he didn't want to devalue. Significant, he said. Temporary, weeks, not months. She nodded slowly. Jon is in the Great Hall. There are things you need to know before you see anyone else. The things he needed to know were considerable. While he'd slept, the political world had continued its motion, with the cheerful indifference to individual sacrifice that he'd observed in political worlds everywhere. The battle at Winterfell had been won. The dead had fallen. The Night King was destroyed. These facts had traveled south at raven speed and arrived in King's Landing and Dragonstone and the halls of every surviving lord in Westeros with the force of seismic events, and the aftershocks were still moving. Jon Snow had killed the Night King. This was the fact that was causing the most structural damage to the existing political arrangements, and Sansa explained it with the careful precision of someone who had been watching the damage spread and mapping its contours. Jon was Aegon Targaryen. That revelation, which had apparently been suppressed by a small number of people for reasons that seemed to get more complicated the more he heard about them, was now loose in the world in a way it could not be recalled. Samwell Tarly had told people. People had told people. The man who had just saved the living world from extinction was, by the bloodline logic of Westerosi succession, the legitimate heir to the Iron Throne, with a stronger claim than Daenerys. He doesn't want it, Sansa said. I know, Magneto said. I've met him. Wanting is irrelevant, she said, in the tone of someone who had learned that lesson early and at significant cost. He's the Targaryen heir who killed the Night King. Every lord in the north is going to declare for him regardless of what he wants because he represents everything the north values and he's the most legitimate claimant alive. Daenerys, she paused, Daenerys came here with dragons and foreign armies and freed him, which creates a debt and is also a rival claimant, which creates a threat. The lords are already choosing sides. He sat with that for a moment. And Cersei? Sansa's expression did something complicated. Well, that's the other thing. The other thing required a raven from King's Landing that Sansa had apparently been deciding whether to show him for the better part of a day. She handed it over with the look of someone releasing a problem they'd been carrying alone and were relieved to share. He read it twice. Cersei had been busy. In the weeks since he'd left King's Landing, she had done something that none of her advisors had anticipated, and that reading between the lines of the carefully worded raven had apparently caused Qyburn to have what could charitably be described as a professional crisis. She had convened a council, not the small council of lords and advisors that the throne had always used, a different kind of council entirely, and one whose membership had apparently caused significant consternation among the established political class. Guildmasters from the city, representatives of the merchant class, A delegation from Flea Bottom, the city's poorest district, chosen by their neighbors in a process that no one had quite managed to call an election, because the word didn't exist yet in Westerosi political vocabulary, but that functioned as one. She had sat with these people for 3 days and listened to them. The Raven didn't say what had been discussed. It said, in Cersei's precise and unadorned prose, that she had found the conversations instructive and that she believed he should return to King's Landing before the political situation calcified in directions that would be difficult to reverse. When he read the last line 3 times, "The wheel has been turning for 3,000 years. The people in this room had never before been asked their opinion of it. I recommend you return before someone reminds them that they were not supposed to be asked." He set the Raven down. He thought about Cersei Lannister sitting in a room with the guildmasters and the merchants and the people of Flea Bottom. Listening, genuinely listening, not performing attention while planning her next move, but actually processing what she heard. He thought about what it would have cost her to do that, given everything she was and everything she'd built, the entire edifice of her identity predicated on the understanding that certain people's opinions were relevant and certain people's were not. He thought about what it meant that she'd done it anyway. I need a horse, he said. "You said you were diminished," Sansa said carefully. "I am. I still need a horse." He stood slowly and found that his legs worked adequately, if not elegantly. "What's Jon's situation?" "He's in the Great Hall receiving the Northern Lord's declarations." She paused. "He looks like a man being buried alive by honor." Jon was indeed in the Great Hall, seated at the high table with the expression of a man performing the most exhausting duty of his life. The Northern Lords were in various stages of declaration, some already pledged, some negotiating the terms of their loyalty with the frank commercial energy of people who respected Jon too much to be subtle about what they wanted in exchange. Magneto stood in the doorway and watched for a moment. Jon saw him, and the relief on his face was unambiguous and somewhat unworthy of the gravity of the occasion. He found a moment to speak to him alone, in a side passage off the hall, while a lord from somewhere called the Rills explained at considerable length to an empty high chair why his family's contribution to the battle deserved specific recognition. Jon looked at him with the clear, exhausted eyes of a man who had killed the Night King 3 days ago and had not yet had a moment to think about what that meant. "Daenerys," Jon said. "Just the name." "I know," Magneto said. "She has a stronger claim than—" "She has a different claim," Magneto said. "Whether it's stronger depends on which theory of legitimate succession you prefer, and Westeros is currently generating new theories of legitimate succession at a remarkable rate." He paused. "What do you actually want, Jon? Not what you're supposed to want. Not what honor requires. What do you want?" Jon was quiet for a long moment. "I want the North to be safe," he said, "and I want it to matter. What we did. What everyone who died out there died for. I don't want it to become the next argument about which house gets what." "Then come south with me," Magneto said. "Both of you. You and Daenerys together before the Lords finish building the argument for you. She won't. I'll talk to her." He talked to her that evening in the Winterfell courtyard. He's standing in the gray northern cold with the smell of the aftermath of battle still in the air, wood smoke and cold earth, and the particular emptiness of a place where a great many people had recently been. Daenerys listened to him without interrupting, which was how he knew she was in a state of genuine distress. When she was comfortable, she pushed back, questioned, argued. This silence was the silence of someone managing something large and fragile inside themselves. He told her what Jon wanted, what he himself was proposing, what Cersei had done in King's Landing. He told her carefully that the moment she and Jon arrived in King's Landing as rivals, the political machinery of every lord in Westeros would immediately begin converting that rivalry into a war, because war was what the machinery was designed to produce. And that the only way to prevent that was to arrive not as rivals, but as something the machinery didn't have a category for. "Partners," she said flatly. "In the original sense of the word," he said, "people who share a goal. We want different things." "You want the same thing," he said. "You've both told me the same thing, in different words on different continents. You want it to mean something, the dying and the losing, and the crossing of seas, and the burning of everything that needed to be burned." He looked at her steadily. "There is a room in King's Landing where people who have never been asked their opinion of the wheel are waiting to be asked again. Cersei Lannister, of all people, has created that room. Whether what happens in it becomes something real or gets crushed by the Lord's arithmetic depends on whether the people with the power to protect it show up. A long silence. Above them, the sky was the deep blue of a northern evening, cold and clear and endless. "He doesn't want the throne," she said. Not a question anymore. "No. Do you believe him?" "I've been reading people's intentions for a very long time," Magneto said. "Jon Snow is genuinely not interested in the throne. What he's interested in is the North being safe and the people he loves being alive, and he's getting one of those things." She looked at the sky for a moment. "I came here to break the wheel," she said quietly. "I know. I didn't come here to share the breaking of it." "No," he said. "But you also didn't come here to be the wheel's last turn." He paused. "Which is what happens if you arrive in King's Landing, alone, and the Lords make it a succession crisis." She was quiet for a very long time. "All right," she said finally. "Together." He nodded. He didn't say what he was thinking, which was that the hardest part was still ahead, that arriving together was the easy declaration, and that what came after, in the throne room, with the Lords watching and centuries of the wheel's momentum pushing against every choice they made, would test all three of them in ways the long night hadn't. The dead had been simple. They wanted only extinction. What came next wanted things that were far more complicated. King's Landing smelled different when he rode back into it. He noticed it before he could name it. Something changed in the texture of the city's atmosphere. Not the smell of the sea or the sewers or the cook fires, but something underneath those things. A quality in the way people moved through the streets. He had spent enough time in enough cities and states of political transition to recognize it without being able to define it precisely. The city was waiting. Not the dull waiting of people who had no agency in what was coming. The sullen patience of populations who had learned that history happened to them rather than through them. Something different. An attentiveness. The specific alertness of people who had been told for the first time that their opinion might matter and who were not yet sure whether to believe it. Cersei's council had done that. He rode through the city and watched the small folk watching him and thought about what an extraordinary thing it was that 3 days of genuine listening could change the texture of an entire city's relationship to its own future. He arrived at the Red Keep to find it transformed in ways both visible and invisible. Visible. The Golden Company was drawn up in the outer courtyard in full battle array, which was either ceremonial or threatening depending on interpretation, and Harry Strickland, their commander, a careful man Magneto had assessed as primarily motivated by professional pride and the contractual obligations of mercenary honor, was standing at their head with an expression that suggested he was waiting to determine which interpretation was correct. And invisible, the quality of the silence in the keep itself, which had the concentrated density of a place where a great many people were thinking very hard and very carefully about which way to move. Cersei met him in the entrance hall. She looked like a woman who had slept approximately as much as he had, which was not enough, and who had spent the intervening time doing the most difficult work of her life, which was apparent in something around her eyes that was not quite exhaustion and not quite resolution, but occupied the territory between them. "The Lords are here," she said without preamble. "Most of them. The ones who aren't sent ravens? They know about Jon." "I know. They're going to try to make it a succession crisis the moment Daenerys and Jon walk through the gate together." "I know that too." She looked at him with the green eyes that were always calculating. "You have a plan. I have a sequence," he said, "which is different from a plan in that a plan assumes cooperation from the situation." "And the sequence?" "First, the council meets. The full council, yours and the Lords together, in the same room before anyone has time to establish the succession argument as the primary frame." He paused. "Second, Daenerys and Jon address that room together, which prevents the Lords from playing them against each other because there's no space to insert the argument if they're already standing side by side. And third?" He looked at her steadily. "Third is the throne room." Daenerys and Jon arrived at midday. He had spoken to each of them separately that morning, and what he'd said to each was different in the specifics, but identical in the essential. "The Lords are going to try to make you choose. Don't choose. The choice they're offering is between two versions of the same wheel, and you didn't come this far to spin it one more time." Daenerys arrived on Drogon, which was exactly the right amount of statement. Present, powerful, undeniable, but landed rather than circling. the difference between assertion and threat. Jon arrived through the gates with Ghost at his side and the remaining northern lords who'd ridden south with him. His bearing the bearing of a man who had stopped performing humility because he'd realized that performing it was its own kind of dishonesty. They walked into the Red Keep together. The lords saw it, and the calculation in every face was immediate and visible. The rapid reassessment of a political class that had been preparing for a competition and had just discovered the competition might not be available in the form they'd planned for. Lord Royce of the Vale looked at Lord Tarly of the Reach, looked at the Martell representative, looked at the Lannister bannerman, and a great silent conversation happened in the space of 5 seconds that concluded, provisionally, in the decision to wait and see. Good. Waiting and seeing was all he needed from them for now. The council met in the Great Hall. All of them. The lords at their end of the long table, arranged by the unspoken hierarchy of whose family had held their lands longest and whose armies were currently largest. At the other end, and this was the thing that had apparently caused Lord Royce to request private clarification 3 times before accepting it was not a mistake, the people Cersei had been meeting with, the guild masters in their guild clothes, the merchant representatives with their ledgers and their practiced expressions of men used to negotiating from positions of less power than they actually held, and the delegation from Flea Bottom. The Flea Bottom delegation was 4 people. A woman who ran a tanning operation and had apparently been chosen by her neighbors because she was known to be impossible to intimidate. An older man who had spent 40 years as a stonemason and whose hands looked like they'd been carved from the same material he'd worked with. And a young woman of perhaps 20 who said nothing for the entire first hour, and then when she spoke, said something so precise that the entire room went quiet. And a former City Watch sergeant who had survived the Battle of the Blackwater and 3 subsequent changes of government with all his limbs attached, which in King's Landing was considered a significant achievement. The lords looked at these 4 people with expressions ranging from bafflement to outrage to a careful blankness that Magneto recognized as the face powerful people made when they were confronted with something they didn't have a category for. Daenerys sat at the table's center, Jon beside her, Cersei across from them, which was a statement about the geometry of power in the room that everyone present was reading and interpreting simultaneously. Magneto stood at the end of the table and said nothing for the first hour. He let them talk. The lords talked about succession and rights and the precedence of 3 centuries of Targaryen rule and the precedence of 3 centuries of subsequent rule and what Aegon the Conqueror would have wanted, which was a remarkable thing to invoke given that Aegon the Conqueror had been dead for the better part of 300 years. They talked about the stability of the realm and the danger of divided loyalty and the importance of clear lines of authority in uncertain times. They did not talk about the long night. They did not talk about who had fought and who had died and what it had cost. They did not talk about the people at the other end of the table. The stonemason cleared his throat at the end of the first hour. Lord Royce looked at him with the expression of a man whose chair has just spoken. "I helped build half the walls in this city," the stonemason said. His voice was the voice of a man used to being heard over construction noise. Not loud, but carrying. 3 kings. Built walls for all of them. Nobody ever asked me what I thought the walls should be for. He looked down the table at the lords. "You're talking about who gets to sit in the chair. You haven't mentioned what the chair is supposed to do." A silence. The young woman from Flea Bottom, her name was Lara, he'd learned. She was a baker's daughter who had somehow taught herself to read and had been running an informal school out of a cellar for 2 years. Looked at the lords with eyes that had not yet learned to perform the deference that experience usually installed. "Hey, my neighbors died in the long night," she said. "The ones who were here, they died because the people who make the decisions about armies and walls and food stores made decisions that didn't include us." She paused. "We'd like that to change." The room was very quiet. Lord Royce opened his mouth. Magneto spoke for the first time. "Lord Royce," he said, "before you say what you're about to say, I want you to think carefully about something." He let the silence sit for a moment. "You are in a room with 2 dragons outside the window, a man who killed the Night King, and a woman who has been redesigning the machinery of this city's governance for 3 weeks with the support of its people." He looked at Royce with the patient attention of a man who had faced down worse. "So the argument you were about to make is an argument about why things should remain as they are. I'd like you to consider whether you're certain that's the argument this room will find convincing." Royce closed his mouth. They talked for 6 hours. It was not clean. It was not the philosophical dialogue of people who had already agreed on first principles, finding elegant practical applications. It was the grinding, difficult, frequently frustrating work of people with genuinely different interests and genuinely different understandings of what the world was for trying to find a shared language. The lords pushed back. Some of them pushed back hard. Lord Jan Royce found his voice eventually and used it with the skill of a man who had been arguing in councils for 30 years. And his argument about the necessity of clear hierarchical authority in times of military threat was not stupid, was in fact the best version of the conservative case, and deserved the serious engagement it received. John gave it serious engagement, which surprised the lords and shouldn't have. He was a man who had spent his life at the intersections of conflicting loyalties and had developed a genuine capacity for holding multiple perspectives simultaneously. Daenerys was more difficult. She was brilliant and she was committed and she genuinely believed in what she was building. And all of those qualities also made her resistant to the kind of incremental compromise that political transformation required. He watched her in the third hour reach the edge of her patience with Lord Tarly's objections and pull herself back from what she'd been about to say with a visible effort that cost her something. He met her eyes across the table and gave her the smallest nod. She straightened and found the longer version of her argument and made it, and Lord Tarly, surprised perhaps by the quality of the engagement, actually listened. Cersei said almost nothing for the first 4 hours, and then, in the 5th hour, said 3 things in quick succession that reframed the entire conversation in ways that left the lords responding to her framing rather than their own. He watched it happen with genuine admiration. Whatever else Cersei Lannister was, she was the finest political intelligence he had encountered in this world. And she had spent 5 hours listening and learning the room before she deployed that intelligence, which was the mark of someone who understood that timing was the first principle of power. By the 6th hour, they had something, not an agreement, not a settlement, a framework, fragile, provisional, full of unresolved tensions that would require years of careful work to navigate. But a framework that contained, for the first time in the history of Westeros, the formal recognition that the people at the other end of the table were not subjects to be governed, but participants in the governing. The stonemason's hands were folded on the table. He had not smiled once in 6 hours, and he did not smile now, but something in the set of his shoulders had changed. Lara the baker's daughter was writing things down in a cramped, yet self-taught hand. The throne room afterward was just the 4 of them. Daenerys, Jon, Cersei, and Magneto in the room with the Iron Throne in the quiet after the council, with the torches burning low and the city outside going about its evening. No ceremony, no audience, no lords. He had asked for that specifically. The Iron Throne sat on its dais and looked exactly as it always looked. Ugly, enormous, made of blades, the most honest monument to power that had ever been constructed in this world, or possibly any other. He looked at Daenerys. She had come here to sit in that chair, had organized her entire life around the claim to it, had paid for that claim in currency that he could not fully calculate, in years of exile and loss and the grinding cost of becoming someone capable of taking what she believed was hers. She stood before it for a long moment. Then she looked at Jon. Jon looked at the throne with the expression he made when confronting things he found straightforwardly terrible and was too honest to pretend otherwise. Cersei looked at it with the expression of a woman saying goodbye to something she had already, privately, finished mourning. Together, Daenerys said. Not a question, a statement, the declaration of a decision that had been made somewhere in the 6th hour of the council, quietly without announcement. Magneto raised his hand. The Iron Throne rose from the dais for the last time. He held it in the air, all those swords, all that history, all those centuries of the wheels turning made physical. And he looked at the 3 of them one more time, making sure. 3 nods. He closed his hand. The Iron Throne came apart, not explosively, not violently, with the careful, deliberate precision of someone who understood that how you ended things mattered as much as that you ended them. Each sword separated cleanly from the whole, 300 years of welded history unwelding in seconds, until what had been the seat of power in Westeros was simply a collection of old blades hanging in the air. He set them down gently on the dais floor. The dais was empty. The room was very quiet. What do we put there instead? Jon asked. Nobody answered immediately because it was the right question, and the right question deserved the serious consideration that the council tomorrow, and the council after that, and the long, difficult work of years would provide. But in the silence of the empty dais, for the first time in 3,000 years, the answer was genuinely open. Spring came to King's Landing 6 weeks after the Iron Throne fell. Not metaphorically, literally the actual season, the first true spring in 12 years, the long winter finally releasing its grip on the continent with the gradual, reluctant warmth of something enormous changing its mind. The city felt it before it saw it. A degree of temperature, 2 degrees, the frozen mud in the streets softening, the rationed food stores, calculated for a winter that had ended sooner than anyone had dared plan for. Suddenly sufficient, and then more than sufficient. The smallest children in Flea Bottom, who had been born into winter and had no memory of anything else, standing in the first genuine warmth and holding their faces up to it with an expression that the adults around them found almost unbearable to witness. Magneto watched it from the window of the modest rooms he still occupied near the Street of Steel. He had been offered chambers in the Red Keep 3 times. He had declined 3 times politely for reasons he'd explained once and didn't intend to repeat. He was not a lord of this world, not a player in its restructured governance, not someone whose presence in the seat of power would send a useful signal about what the new arrangement meant. The work he'd come to do was done. What happened now needed to happen without him at the center of it. That was harder than it sounded. He had spent his entire adult life at the center of things, by inclination and by necessity, and the discipline of stepping back without stepping away required a daily effort he found quietly exhausting. But it was right. He knew it was right. He had learned, went across decades of being wrong in ways that cost other people enormously, to recognize the specific feeling of a right decision that was also a difficult one. The council met every week now, not the small council of lords that had advised the throne for 3 centuries. Something different, something that was still finding its own shape, still arguing about its own name, still navigating the profound practical difficulties of building a new thing inside the ruins of an old one, while the people who'd built the old one were still in the room. It was messy, frequently contentious, occasionally farcical. There had been a 3-hour argument in the 4th week about the procedural question of how decisions were recorded and who kept the records and what the records were called, which had somehow become a proxy war for every unresolved tension in the room and had ended with Lara, the baker's daughter, proposing a solution so elegant that everyone had agreed to it before they'd fully processed what they were agreeing to. He attended when asked, which was most weeks. He sat at the edge of the room and said little. He had found that the quality of his contribution was higher when he resisted the impulse to speak first, and lower when he let the satisfaction of having the right answer override the question of whether this was the right moment for it. John chaired most sessions. He was better at it than he'd expected to be. The quality that made him uncomfortable with power, the genuine indifference to his own position, turned out to be exactly what the chair required. He listened without agenda. He asked questions that opened arguments rather than closing them. He made the people at the end of the table, the stonemason, Lara, the tanner, the city watch sergeant, and his rotating cast of replacements, feel that their presence in the room was not contingent on their continuing to be useful to someone else's goals. Daenerys was harder. He had not pretended otherwise to her or to himself. She was brilliant and committed, and she believed in this, genuinely believed in it, and she was also someone who had organized her entire identity around a particular theory of how change happened. Through will, through power, through the force of a single transformative vision imposed on a resistant world. Sharing the vision was not the same as having it. Was in the council's endless procedural negotiations and incremental compromises and genuine disagreements were frequently in tension with her instinct to simply decide. She and John fought about it, quietly, in the way that people who respected each other fought, with honesty and without cruelty, and with the specific frustration of 2 people who agreed on the destination and disagreed on the route. Cersei mediated. That was the thing that continued to surprise him most. Cersei Lannister, who had spent her entire life as the most ruthless practitioner of zero-sum politics he had encountered in this world, had discovered in the council room a facility for mediation that she'd apparently possessed all along and never had occasion to use. She understood every person's position completely, understood the fear underneath the position, or the history underneath the fear, and she could translate between them in ways that made genuine understanding possible without requiring anyone to capitulate. He had told her, after one particularly impressive piece of shuttle diplomacy between Jon and a Reach Lord who'd been threatening to withdraw his support, that she was wasted as a queen. She had looked at him with those green eyes and said, "I know, I've always known. I simply didn't have another option until now." Tyrion found him in his rooms on a gray morning in the 5th week. He arrived with wine he'd brought himself and the expression of a man who had something to say that he'd been composing for some time and was finally ready to deliver. He sat down without being invited, poured 2 cups, pushed one across the table, and looked at Magneto with the sharp, affectionate, my slightly melancholy attention that was his characteristic mode. "You're leaving," Tyrion said, not a question. "Soon," Magneto said. "How do you know? About the... whatever it is. The way back." "I can feel it," he said. It was true. For the past 3 days, he'd been aware of something at the edge of his perception. Not magnetic exactly, but related to magnetism. A disturbance in the field that had the same signature as the anomaly that had brought him here. It was building slowly. He estimated days, not weeks. The same way I arrived. A discontinuity in the field. When it opens fully, I'll be able to pass through it. And if you miss it, then I stay, he said simply, and wait for the next one. Or I don't go back at all. He looked at his cup. "I've considered that." Tyrion was quiet for a moment. "Have you told them?" "Not yet. They'll want to." "I know what they'll want," he said, not harshly. "I'll tell them today." Tyrion looked at him for a long moment with the expression he wore when he was deciding whether to say the thing he'd actually come to say. "You could stay," Tyrion said. "You know that. You're not. This doesn't have to be someone else's world. You've earned a place in it." He thought about that seriously, as it deserved. He thought about the council and the spring warmth and the stonemason's changed shoulders and Lara writing things down in her cramped hand. He thought about Sansa Stark in the chair across from him while he slept, taking shifts with the matter-of-fact care of someone who had decided he was worth keeping alive. He thought about Jon on the ridge, on her moving through the disrupted deadlines without being asked, because it was the right thing to do, and Jon Snow did not require more reason than that. He thought about his world, about Charles, who was almost certainly convinced he was dead, and was almost certainly, in the way he did everything, grieving productively and continuing to build the thing they'd spent their lives disagreeing about how to build. About the people in his world who were still fighting the version of this fight that had never been fully won there either. "There are people in my world who need what I can do," he said. "The same fight, different battlefield." "There are people in this world who need what you can do," Tyrion said. "Yes," he said, "but they have each other now, and they know what they're doing." He looked at Tyrion. "Your world has you, and that's not nothing." Tyrion looked at his wine. "High praise from a man who can move mountains." "I can't move mountains," Magneto said. "I can move the iron in them. It's a distinction that matters." Tyrion smiled despite himself. He told them that afternoon, all 4 of them together in the room they'd taken to meeting in. Not the throne room, not the council chamber, but a smaller room with windows that looked south over the city, informal enough to permit honesty without the performance that formal spaces demanded. Their reactions were true to character, which he found he valued. Jon nodded slowly, with the expression of a man who had expected this and had been deciding how to feel about it for some time. "The people in your world," he said, "they're like you, different and..." "Yes," Magneto said. "Oh, and the people who fear them are doing what people who fear difference always do." Jon nodded again. That was enough for him. The logic was sufficient. The need was real. The man was going where he was needed. Jon Snow understood that framework without requiring it to be elaborated. Daenerys said nothing for a long moment and then said, "Will you come back?" "I don't know how this works well enough to promise that," he said. "The anomaly is not something I control." "But if you could..." He looked at her. "If I could," he said, "yes." She held his gaze for a moment and then nodded once, with the decisive quality she brought to all her decisions, as if she was filing the answer and moving on. Cersei stood at the window with her back to the room during most of this, unany in the manner she had when she was processing something she wasn't ready to make available to observation. When she turned, her face was composed in the way it always was, the immaculate Lannister control, and underneath it, something that she let him see for exactly 1 second before she put it away. "You changed the game," she said. "You changed the game," he said. "I pointed out that it was a game." Something moved at the corner of her mouth that wasn't quite a smile. "The council will be fine," she said. "We'll make it work." "I know you will," he said. And he did know. He had spent 70 years learning to read the difference between people performing intention and people who had actually changed their relationship to power, and what he saw in this room was the latter. Fragile, incomplete, each certain to be tested by forces that were already gathering in the Lord's halls and the merchants' counting rooms, and the inevitable human impulse to consolidate and exclude. But real, genuinely, structurally real in ways that the wheel's previous configurations had not been. It would not be perfect, but it would be something. The anomaly opened on a Tuesday, or what passed for Tuesday, in a world that organized its weeks differently and didn't use that name. He felt it at dawn, the discontinuity sharpening from a distant pressure into a present fact, a tear in the field that was widening with the patient momentum of a natural process reaching its completion. He had perhaps 4 hours. He spent them walking. Through King's Landing in the early morning, in the city waking around him with the specific sounds and smells of a place that had survived something enormous and was still, cautiously, beginning to believe in its own future. The street of steel, where the blacksmiths were already at their forges, the ring of iron on iron, a sound that had accompanied his entire life in every city he'd ever loved or lost. The market where the food stalls were setting up with fuller stocks than they'd had in years. The square and flea bottom, where Lara's cellar school had moved above ground into a building that the council had formally designated for education 2 weeks ago, the first such designation in the history of the city. He walked past it and saw through the window Lara writing on a board, while a room full of children watched with the focused attention of people being given something they'd understood they needed before they had a word for it. He did not stop. He didn't want to interrupt. He walked to the waterfront and stood at the harbor's edge and looked out at the bay, the morning light on the water, the ships moving in and out with the commerce of a world that was, tentatively, beginning to imagine what peace might feel like after so long pretending to know. He thought about what he'd done here, and what he hadn't done, and what he'd gotten wrong, and what had gone better than expected. And he felt the anomaly building to its threshold. And he thought about Charles, who would listen to all of it with the patient attention he'd always had, and then ask the one question that went straight to what mattered. And he thought about the fight that was waiting for him, the unfinished permanent fight that would never be fully won and had to be continued anyway. He reached into his coat and took out the last thing he'd made in Winterfell's forge, a small disc of iron, unadorned, the size of a large coin. He'd made it during those 6 hours as a test piece, working out the technique he'd eventually used against the Night King. It was nothing. A scrap, a practice run, no significance except what he assigned it. He set it on the harbor wall. Let it stay here. Let this world keep something of him, even something small and meaningless. He had taken enough from places he'd passed through. For once he wanted to leave something behind without it being rubble. The anomaly peaked. He looked at King's Landing one last time, the city on the bay, the Red Keep on its hill with its empty throne room and its occupied council chamber, the dragons visible as distant shapes in the morning sky, the spring light on everything, and felt something he didn't have a precise word for. Not satisfaction, not completion. Something closer to the feeling of a long note resolving, a tension releasing into something that was not its opposite but its natural consequence. He had not fixed this world. He had helped 3 remarkable people find each other in it, and pointed at the machinery underneath the mythology, and demonstrated once against an army of the dead in a frozen field. Sure that the things which seemed unstoppable could be disrupted if you were willing to pay the cost. That was enough. That had to be enough. He stepped into the anomaly and went home. The iron disc sat on the harbor wall for 3 days before a fisherman's child found it and took it home, not knowing what it was or where it had come from, only that it was smooth and heavy and caught the light in a way that seemed like it might be important. She kept it for the rest of her life. She never knew whose it was. She never needed to. The wheel had turned for 3,000 years. For the first time, the people underneath it had been asked which direction it should go. That was not the end of the story, but it was at last a different beginning. The game has changed. The fight goes on. If you want to see what happens when another outsider walks into a world that wasn't built for them, drop a name in the comments. Any universe, any character. The next story is waiting.